In a quiet suburban town where racial prejudices often linger beneath a polished surface, an elderly black man named Henry finds himself the target of a group of local men who let their biases erupt into verbal and physical aggression. Unbeknownst to them, Henry's son, General Marcus Williams, arrives just in time to confront the men and hold them accountable. Through the strength and dignity of both father and son, the story explores the deep scars of racism, the complicity of silence, and the power of resilience and justice in the face of hate. Get ready for a story that challenges your perceptions, ignites your conscience, and reminds us of the courage it takes to stand against injustice. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mr. Denzel Stories for more powerful narratives. Your support fuels these stories and ensures their voices are heard. The town of Marbury looked like it had been plucked from a postcard. Rows of pristine houses stood side by side, their brick facades glowing warmly under the afternoon sun. A neat park, complete with a playground and a small gazebo, served as the neighborhood's centerpiece. Children laughed as they played on swings while adults sipped coffee at nearby benches. It was a scene of tranquility, a testament to the town's reputation for being safe and tight-knit. But for those who had lived there long enough, the polished surface concealed a darker truth. Marbury was a place where belonging was not just about owning a home or having a friendly smile. The unwritten rules of the community dictated that true acceptance required blending in, a standard many could not meet. For all its outward charm, the town was a fortress of unchallenged biases. The residents rarely voiced their prejudices outright, but the signs were unmistakable to those who cared to notice. A new face at the grocery store might receive an extra-long stare. A neighbor's hushed comments about a family moving into the wrong area would ripple through social circles, passed off as harmless observations. The park on Willow Street was a regular meeting spot for a group of men who considered themselves the backbone of the community. Todd, a broad-shouldered contractor with a booming voice, was their unspoken leader. Alongside him were Rick, a wiry man with quick hands and a sharper tongue, and two others who followed their lead with a mix of admiration and insecurity. They spent their afternoons in the park, exchanging jokes and sharing beers from an inconspicuous cooler tucked under a bench. To the casual observer, they were just friends enjoying each other's company. But their conversations often veered into dangerous territory, peppered with jokes and jabs that revealed the true depths of their beliefs. Todd had a habit of steering their discussions towards how things used to be better. Rick, ever the instigator, loved to punctuate Todd's laments with snide remarks about outsiders and how they were changing everything. It was during one such afternoon that Henry arrived. The elderly black man carried himself with quiet grace, his gait steady despite his years. His brown coat, though old, was clean and neatly pressed. His flat cap shaded his thoughtful face, the lines around his mouth speaking to a life of resilience and hard-earned wisdom. Henry wasn't a stranger to places like Marbury, nor to the silent scrutiny that followed him wherever he went. He had come to visit a friend nearby and decided to rest at the park before heading home. As Henry walked along the path toward an empty bench, the men at the other end of the park took notice. Their laughter quieted as they exchanged glances, each man's expression reflecting the same unspoken thought. To them, Henry was not just a passerby. He was an anomaly, a disruption to the unspoken order they thought they maintained. Henry set his bag down, pulled out a modest lunch, and began eating. He was aware of the eyes on him, but decades of experience had taught him to remain calm in such situations. He focused on the simple pleasure of his meal, but his calm presence seemed to unsettle the men across the park. Their quiet murmurs soon turned into pointed stares, and the easy camaraderie they had shared moments before began to twist into something darker. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the park, but the tension brewing among the men grew heavier than the fading daylight. Todd leaned back on the bench, his eyes narrowing as he watched Henry. His laughter, once genuine, now carried an edge of something more sinister. He nudged Rick with his elbow, nodding toward the elderly man sitting peacefully on the bench. "Look at him," Todd muttered, keeping his voice low enough that only the group could hear. "Sitting there like he owns the place." Rick snorted, taking a swig from his beer. "Probably lost. They don't usually come around here, do they?" The others chuckled nervously, feeding off each other's energy. Their whispers grew louder, their stares more direct, as they exchanged petty observations about Henry. His clothes, his posture, even the way he ate his sandwich. It was as though his mere presence was an affront to their perceived control of the space. Henry, for his part, remained undisturbed. He had seen this before, many times, in many places. The quiet judgment, the hostile stares, they were familiar companions. He focused on his meal, his calm demeanor unshaken by their growing discomfort. But he wasn't oblivious. He could feel the weight of their attention, the way their voices sharpened with each passing moment. Still, he refused to acknowledge them. He would not give them the satisfaction. Rick, emboldened by Todd's nod of encouragement, decided to escalate. "Hey," he called out, his voice cutting across the park. "You lost, old man?" Henry looked up, meeting Rick's gaze with a calm but firm expression. "No," he said simply. His voice was steady, without a hint of hostility. "Just taking a rest." The brevity of Henry's response seemed to irritate Rick. "Oh, taking a rest, huh?" he said, standing up from the bench. He walked a few steps closer, gesturing vaguely at the surrounding park. "Funny place to take a rest. Don't you have somewhere else to be?" Henry took a moment before responding, carefully folding the wrapper of his sandwich and placing it back into his bag. He met Rick's gaze again, his eyes unwavering. "This is a public park," he said. "I have every right to be here." Rick's face twisted into a smirk. "Oh, is that so? Look, we're just trying to help. You look out of place." Todd stood now, joining Rick in his approach. "Yeah, Rick's right. This isn't exactly the best spot for sightseeing." His tone was light, almost playful, but the undercurrent of threat was unmistakable. "Might want to move along." Henry sighed quietly, rising to his feet. He wasn't a man to back down, but he also knew the futility of reasoning with people like this. He gathered his bag, slinging it over his shoulder. "I'll leave when I'm ready," he said, his voice calm but firm. The answer seemed to ignite something in Todd. His jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You don't talk to me like that," he said, stepping closer. "You think you can come in here, act like you belong, and tell me what to do?" Henry didn't move. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on Todd's. "I've said nothing to offend you," he replied. "You're the one choosing to make this a problem." Rick laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "Oh, he's got a mouth on him, doesn't he?" He turned to the others, who had gathered behind him, their expressions a mix of amusement and discomfort. "What do you think, boys? Should we teach him some manners?" The others hesitated, shifting awkwardly. One of them, a younger man named Kyle, looked uneasy. "Come on, guys," he said, his voice quiet. "He's just sitting here. Let's leave it." But Todd ignored him, his focus locked on Henry. "You think you're better than us?" he snarled. "Walking in here like you own the place, like you've got the right to look down on us?" Henry held his gaze, unflinching. "I think everyone has the right to be treated with respect," he said. "That's all." Todd barked a laugh, a cruel, humorless sound. "Respect? From you?" He took another step closer, his face inches from Henry's. "I don't think you understand how things work around here." The bystanders in the park began to notice the confrontation, their conversations quieting as they turned to watch. Some shifted uncomfortably, clearly disapproving, but no one intervened. A few glanced at their phones, but none made a move to call for help. The air grew heavy with tension, the silence amplifying the standoff between the two men. Rick broke the silence, his voice dripping with mockery. "You gonna run now, old man? Or are you just gonna stand there and take it?" Henry's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to show fear. He stood tall, his voice steady as he replied, "I've stood my ground against far worse than you. Do what you will, but know this. You'll only show the world what kind of men you are." The group tightened their circle around Henry, their taunts growing louder and more pointed. The once cheerful park now felt like an arena, the tension palpable even among the bystanders. Some shifted on their benches, casting nervous glances toward the unfolding scene, while others pretended not to notice. The silence of those who chose inaction spoke volumes, their avoidance as sharp as the words being hurled at Henry. Todd's posture was aggressive, his chest puffed out, his fists clenching and unclenching. Rick stood beside him, a cruel grin spreading across his face as he watched Todd push the confrontation forward. The others hung back slightly, their faces betraying a mix of excitement and discomfort, as if they were trying to decide whether to fully commit to the hostility or fade into the background. "You're real quiet now," Todd said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Where's all that talk about respect? You were so full of yourself a minute ago." Henry stood his ground, his shoulders straight, his gaze unwavering. He refused to dignify the man's words with a response. His silence wasn't a retreat. It was a statement, a refusal to play their game. But his composure, his quiet strength, only seemed to enrage them further. Rick stepped closer, his voice a sneer. "You think you're better than us, don't you? That's why you're just standing there, looking down your nose at us." "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Henry replied calmly. "But I won't lower myself to your level." The words struck like a match to dry kindling. Todd surged forward, shoving Henry hard enough to make him stumble. Henry caught himself, steadying his feet, but he didn't retaliate. Instead, he looked Todd in the eye, his expression a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "You think that makes you strong?" Henry asked quietly. "Pushing an old man? Using anger to prove your worth? That doesn't show strength. It shows fear." The men around Todd let out a collective gasp, their laughter tinged with nervous energy. Todd's face flushed red, his anger boiling over. He took another step toward Henry, his hand rising as if to strike him, but paused when Rick placed a hand on his arm. "Easy, man," Rick said, though his grin never wavered. "Don't waste your time. He's just trying to get under your skin." "Under my skin?" Todd repeated, his voice rising. He turned back to Henry, his expression livid. "You're lucky I don't teach you a lesson right here and now." Henry's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "You already have, Todd. You've shown me who you are." Rick laughed loudly, turning to the others. "You hear that? He's got jokes now. Guess he thinks he's clever." One of the younger men, Kyle, shifted uncomfortably. His earlier unease had grown into outright anxiety as the situation escalated. "Guys, come on," he said, his voice tentative. "This is going too far. Just let him go." Todd shot Kyle a glare, his voice sharp. "If you're too scared to stick around, then leave. No one's stopping you." Kyle hesitated, glancing between Todd and Henry. The others didn't say anything, their silence a tacit approval of Todd's authority. Kyle lowered his gaze, muttering something under his breath, but he didn't leave. The bystanders in the park were no better. A couple seated on a nearby bench whispered to each other, their eyes darting between the confrontation and their phones. A jogger slowed to a stop, watching from a distance before quickly deciding to move on. No one stepped forward to intervene. The weight of complicity hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Todd took another step toward Henry, his voice dripping with venom. "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't your place. You don't belong here." "I belong wherever I choose to be," Henry replied, his voice steady. "And so do you. But the difference between us is that I don't need to push others down to feel like I belong." The words hit Todd like a slap, and his composure shattered. He lunged at Henry, his hand grabbing the front of Henry's coat. The movement was fast, fueled by anger, but Henry didn't flinch. He stood firm, meeting Todd's aggression with a quiet dignity that only served to highlight the injustice of the moment. "Let go," Henry said firmly, his voice calm but commanding. For a brief moment, Todd hesitated. There was something in Henry's tone, in his unshakable resolve, that made Todd falter. But the hesitation was fleeting. His pride, bruised and battered by Henry's refusal to submit, demanded satisfaction. Rick, sensing the moment slipping away, decided to up the ante. He stepped forward, his grin widening. "What's the matter, Todd? Afraid of the old man? You've got to show him who's in charge." The others murmured in agreement, their voices a mix of encouragement and nervous energy. Even those who had been hesitant earlier now seemed swept up in the momentum of the group, their individual doubts drowned out by the collective urge to escalate. Todd, spurred on by the group, tightened his grip on Henry's coat. "You've got a lot to say for someone who's outnumbered," he sneered. "But let's see how tough you are without all your words." The first shove was hard enough to knock Henry back a step. The second came with more force, sending him stumbling into the bench behind him. Henry caught himself, his hands gripping the edge of the bench as he straightened. His chest rose and fell with deep, measured breaths, but his expression didn't change. "I won't fight you," Henry said, his voice low but resolute. "Not because I can't, but because I won't stoop to your level." The declaration only seemed to fuel Todd's anger. He raised his fist, the final blow ready to land. The group fell silent, the air crackling with tension as they waited for the inevitable. But before the fist could connect, a new voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Enough." The command was like a whip cracking in the air, stopping Todd mid-swing. Everyone turned toward the source of the voice. Standing at the park's edge was a tall man in full military uniform, his presence exuding authority and strength. His broad shoulders were squared, and his dark eyes burned with a mixture of controlled anger and determination. It was General Marcus Williams, Henry's son. Todd froze, his fist still raised, the tension in the air now replaced with a sudden unease. Rick looked between Todd and the imposing figure of Marcus, his smirk faltering for the first time. The other men shifted nervously, the bravado they had moments ago dissolving under the weight of Marcus's unwavering gaze. "Let him go," Marcus said, enunciating each word with deliberate precision. His voice carried the kind of command that demanded immediate compliance, a tone honed through years of leading soldiers in high-stakes situations. Todd hesitated, his grip on Henry's coat loosening slightly, but he didn't release him. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. Marcus took a step forward, his boots striking the pavement with a force that seemed to echo across the park. "I'm the man who will ensure you face the consequences of what you're doing here." "Now," I said, "let him go." There was no room for argument in his tone. Todd finally released Henry, shoving him back with a frustrated grunt. Henry staggered slightly but steadied himself, brushing off his coat with slow, deliberate movements. He turned to look at Marcus, a mixture of relief and gratitude in his eyes. The bystanders who had been silently watching the scene now seemed unable to look away. Some exchanged murmurs, pointing toward Marcus, while others simply stared in stunned silence. The shift in power was palpable, and the gang, who moments ago had seemed so dominant, now looked small and uncertain. "You think you can just walk in here and tell us what to do?" Rick said, attempting to reclaim some of his earlier bravado. But even as he spoke, his voice wavered, and his eyes darted nervously toward Marcus. Marcus didn't so much as blink. "You don't recognize me, do you?" he asked, his voice cold. "I've seen men like you before, men who think their strength comes from intimidating others. But let me tell you something. True strength is standing up for what's right, not tearing others down to feel powerful." Rick took a step back, glancing at Todd for support, but Todd was silent, his jaw tight as he avoided Marcus's gaze. Marcus turned his attention to the entire group, his voice rising slightly. "You think you're strong because you outnumber an elderly man? You think the world respects cowards like you? Let me make this clear. This isn't just going to be swept under the rug. You will face the consequences of your actions." Todd finally found his voice, though it was tinged with desperation. "Look, we weren't doing anything serious. Just having a little fun. No harm done." "No harm done?" Marcus repeated, his voice incredulous. He pointed toward Henry. "You shoved an elderly man, threatened him, hurled racist insults at him. And you think there's no harm in that? You think your words and actions don't have weight?" Henry stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Marcus, let them speak. Let them show who they are." Marcus glanced at his father, the anger in his eyes tempered by respect for Henry's measured tone. Henry turned to the group, his gaze steady. "You've had your say," he said. "But understand this, your actions don't define me. They define you." The words hung in the air, cutting through the gang's defenses like a knife. Todd opened his mouth to respond, but found himself unable to form the words. The weight of Henry's dignity and Marcus's authority left him and his friends floundering. Marcus took out his phone, his movements slow and deliberate. "I've recorded everything," he said, holding the device up for them to see. "The threats, the assault, every word. You can either apologize now and take responsibility, or we can let the police and the courts handle this." The color drained from Rick's face. "Look, man, we didn't mean it," he stammered. "We were just messing around. It got out of hand." "It always starts with, 'we didn't mean it,'" Marcus replied coldly. "But you meant every word, every action. You meant to humiliate and intimidate my father because you thought no one would stop you." Todd's shoulders slumped, his earlier bravado gone. He muttered something under his breath, too low to hear. "What was that?" Marcus demanded. "Speak up." "I'm sorry," Todd said, his voice barely above a whisper. The others quickly followed suit, mumbling apologies that rang hollow in the face of their earlier actions. Henry held up a hand, silencing Marcus before he could respond. "I've heard enough," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made even Marcus pause. "They'll live with what they've done. That's punishment enough." Marcus nodded reluctantly, but kept his gaze fixed on the group. "This isn't over," he said. "If I ever hear of you pulling something like this again, you'll regret it." The gang dispersed quickly, their heads down, their earlier confidence shattered. The bystanders slowly resumed their activities, though the air of discomfort lingered. Some approached Henry and Marcus, offering hesitant words of support, but many simply walked away, unwilling to confront the deeper issues the scene had revealed. Marcus turned to his father, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked. Henry nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm fine, son. Thank you for stepping in." Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You shouldn't have had to go through that." "No," Henry agreed, "but it's nothing new. And it won't stop until people like them are held accountable." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "And they will be. I'll make sure of it." The park grew quieter as the gang shuffled away, their heads down and shoulders slumped. The weight of their actions hung in the air, mingling with the awkward silence of the bystanders who began to disperse. Some threw furtive glances at Henry and Marcus as they passed, while others avoided eye contact altogether. The scene had shifted, but its impact lingered. Marcus turned to Henry, his sharp military demeanor softening as he placed a steadying hand on his father's shoulder. "Let me walk you home," he said, his voice low and filled with concern. It wasn't a request. Henry chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "You think I can't walk on my own?" His tone was light, but the weariness in his eyes betrayed the emotional toll of the encounter. "It's not about that," Marcus replied. "I just want to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine, Marcus. I've been dealing with men like that my entire life." Henry adjusted his coat, his hands moving with a practiced calm. "But I have to admit, I'm glad you were here today. Not for me. I can handle their hate, but for them. Maybe now they'll think twice before they try something like this again." Marcus frowned, his jaw tight as he fought to keep his emotions in check. "They didn't deserve your kindness," he said. "And they sure as hell didn't deserve your forgiveness." Henry stopped walking and turned to face his son. "It's not about what they deserve," he said gently. "It's about who I choose to be. Hate won't change them, Marcus. It only feeds their fire. But dignity? That's something they can't take away from me." For a moment, Marcus was silent, the weight of his father's words settling over him. He looked at Henry, seeing not just his father but a man who had weathered decades of injustice and still carried himself with grace. It humbled him, even as it made him burn with anger. "They're cowards," Marcus said finally. "Every single one of them." "Yes," Henry agreed. "But they're not the only ones. Did you see how many people just stood there? Watching, saying nothing? It's not just the loud ones, son. It's the quiet ones, too." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I'll make sure the quiet ones don't get to stay quiet anymore. They'll hear about this. I'll make sure of it." Henry smiled, his pride in his son evident. "I know you will." As they walked toward home, the park behind them fading into the distance, Marcus couldn't help but glance back. The empty bench where his father had been sitting seemed almost symbolic now, a quiet reminder of the strength it took to endure and the work still left to be done. The events of the day lingered in Marcus's mind long after they left the park. That encounter had not been just an isolated incident. It was a mirror reflecting the broader reality of a society steeped in prejudice, where silence often aided injustice. For Henry, it was another chapter in a lifetime of facing such encounters, but for Marcus, it felt personal in a way that demanded action. Racism, Marcus thought, wasn't just in the hateful words or the clenched fists. It was in the bystanders who averted their eyes, the murmurs of quiet disapproval that never rose to action, and the systems that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. It was a force that seeped into every corner of life, a heavy burden borne disproportionately by people like his father. Marcus glanced at Henry, who walked beside him with his head held high. His father's dignity in the face of cruelty was something Marcus had always admired. Henry's refusal to retaliate wasn't weakness. It was strength of a kind that Marcus, even with all his military training, could only hope to emulate. Yet, as much as Marcus respected his father's approach, he couldn't ignore the anger simmering within him. He thought of the gang, Todd, Rick, and the others, men who had likely lived their entire lives without ever being held accountable for their actions. They had attacked an innocent man not because of anything he had done, but because of who he was. And they had done so with the confidence that no one would stop them. That confidence came from somewhere, Marcus realized. It was built on the complicity of those who stood by and did nothing, on the systemic indifference that allowed hate to flourish. And until people like him, those with voices, power, and platforms, stepped forward, nothing would change. His father's words replayed in his mind. It's not just the loud ones, son. It's the quiet ones, too. Marcus resolved then and there to ensure those quiet ones could no longer hide. He would share what had happened, not just with friends or colleagues, but with the broader community. He would use his position and his voice to challenge the comfort of silence and force people to confront the ugly truths they preferred to ignore. For Henry, the incident was a painful reminder of the work still left to be done. It wasn't enough to endure. It wasn't enough to survive. Change required persistence, action, and allies willing to stand up and speak out. While Henry was proud of his son for stepping in when he had, he knew the real victory would come when men like Todd and Rick were the minority, not the norm, and when bystanders chose action over inaction. As they reached home, Henry paused, looking at Marcus with a faint smile. Today wasn't just about them, you know, he said. It was about everyone who was watching. Maybe someone saw what happened and realized it's time to stand up. Marcus nodded, the weight of his father's wisdom settling over him. We'll make sure of it, he said. Together. The moral was clear. Prejudice, when unchecked, festers in silence. But with courage, dignity, and action, even the smallest moments of resistance could spark change. Change was slow, painful, and often incomplete, but it was possible. And for Henry and Marcus, that possibility was worth fighting for.